Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Ferguson. I'm excited to learn more about this important topic.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so that you all can see this presentation I have for you. All right. Can we see that okay? Yep. Awesome. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my work broadly and focus it in on how we can promote principles of social justice in children and why that is necessary from a developmental science standpoint. So we're going to talk a bit about how we actually raise social justice advocates. And if we kind of place it under this notion of social justice advocacy being another form of kindness or empathy, and understanding that that might look different for different communities, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, and why it's important all of us actively ascribe to these principles in our parenting practices. So I had a wonderful introduction, so I'm just going to skip through this. But part of what led me to this work, which has been a bit more recent in my career trajectory, was becoming a mother myself. So I am a second generation South Asian immigrant. I have lived here and in India throughout my life at different points in life. And I am in a multiracial, multi-faith partnership and the mom of a Blindian child. So my child is biracial, Black and Indian. And when I became a mom, I started to realize how little we had when it came to resources for parents from historically marginalized communities and how we support them in parenting practices, which is how we created Parenting Culture, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. But it's essentially a platform that is accessible to anyone. It's free resources that are geared towards parents, educators, practitioners, and we try and tackle parenting from a much more inclusive lens. And the folks that are curating the resources are all parents themselves, but we're all clinical psychologists with expertise in children's mental health as well. And we have a range of expertise ranging from early childhood all the way through adolescence. And we even have a fathering expert on our team as well. So a lot of our resources, our guides are kind of innovative in that they address topics that don't otherwise come up in an intervention standpoint or in mainstream kind of conversations either. If we think of how we are raised, many times conversations regarding race or gender identity development, racial identity development, we don't often get tools for how to cultivate that with our children, but it's so important that we do because there's so much science that talks about why this is necessary. And that's what we're going to unpack a little bit today. I just mentioned some of my identities, and I have gotten better and more accustomed to kind of introducing some aspects of my cultural identity in professional spaces, because I think it's really important that we acknowledge not only our professional identities of who we are in the workspace, but how that is informed by a lot of our other cultural identities. And every single one of us has several cultural identities that intersect and make us who we are, and then inform the decisions and behaviors and actions that we take in a given day. So this notion of intersectionality is important for us to explore, and just essentially means that all of us have intersections of identities that result from unique overlapping structures for each one of us, and that no one social structure really defines any of us, even though in our societies, we often focus on things like race or gender. Not one thing alone makes up who we are. And that's really important for us to instill in our children as well. And we're talking about this idea of social justice advocacy. So it's important we talk about what that means first and foremost. So when we're speaking to a social justice advocate, we're simply speaking about somebody who promotes human rights by either organizing efforts or creating socially just policies, attitudes, and environments. So social justice work should be something all of us are doing in every single one of our spaces and every single one of our conversations and every single one of our environments. Traditionally, when we think of this topic of racism, we often think of it as a binary. So we think that we either check yes or no if somebody thinks about whether they're being racist or not in a given situation. And the reality is it doesn't operate on a binary. We have to think about racism and anti-racist work on a continuum, with anti-racism on one end and overt racism on the other end. And the reality is that most of us often tend to fall towards that overt racism end of the spectrum. And many of us don't ever really make it to that anti-racism end of the spectrum. And I say this myself included, despite this being an area of quote unquote expertise for me, because anti-racism is very hard to achieve. And it takes an active, lifelong, fluid process of learning and adapting and changing to our social justice landscape. And because of the system that we operate in, it becomes very hard for us to actually truly be anti-racist. But what we can do is continue to work on ourselves in this process and the work that we do and how we raise children and how we raise the next generation to keep us inching towards that other end of the spectrum. Now let's talk developmental science. So why am I talking about race? Why am I talking about racism when we're talking about young children and parenting? Well, we know through a wealth of research that children actually notice race-based differences as early as 4 to 6 months of age. By the time they're 2 to 4 years old, they start to internalize racial biases. And by the time they're 10 to 12, they become pretty set in their racial biases and beliefs. And 10 to 12 years does not feel like a lot of time for us to work on these things. So we have to start early and we have to have these conversations often. Now, children's racial biases are informed by a whole host of things, which include things like how much they are racially socialized, as well as parental biases and parental modeling, and the environments in which they are raised in. So in order for our systems to alter and for us to really truly shift to become more equitable as a society, every family has to start engaging in racial socialization practices. And we'll talk about what that is and what that looks like in a second. I always share this story about my child and noticing these processes play out for him. So my son is now about 3.5 years old, but he's a little bit of a pandemic baby. So he was born about 2 to 3 months before the pandemic hit. And the week that I was getting ready to head back into work from maternity leave, we entered lockdown. So we became very isolated as a family because we didn't know what COVID was doing to young children at that time. We didn't want to take too many risks. We had family members with health issues. So we were pretty isolative and protective. So my son spent about the first 9 months of his life only really seeing myself, my husband, and his grandparents from respective families, and media that was representative of diverse kiddos in his children's books, or the music videos that we would watch on TV to help him calm down. So that's much of what his world looked like in his first several months of life. I remember when he was about 6 months old, we took a walk in the neighborhood and we ran into a neighbor who is a great friend of mine, very nurturing, very kind. And she approached my son as she had like a couple months before when we had run into her. But this time he lost his mind. And he is a very social, very extroverted little child, and he lost it. He had this fear-based response that we just had not seen in him. And then this happened again when we saw her the following week, and then it happened again. And it took me a second to realize what was happening. My neighbor is white, and he's not used to seeing people who were not people of color. So he had this fear-based response because of his lack of socialization with white populations at that point. And now he's in daycare. He's got several friends from all different backgrounds, racial backgrounds, including white friends. He is well adjusted and fine. But what does not always happen is the reverse. What does not always happen is that white children aren't always afforded opportunities to racially socialize with marginalized communities or minoritized groups unless their parents are intentionally doing so. and intentionally exposing them to content and people that are different from them or dominant culture. So I share that story to say it was kind of an eye opener to see the developmental science play out for us with our own child. And it started to kind of have some thoughts percolate and move some things around for us to help us realize that we needed to have these discussions much more openly, and we needed everybody to have these conversations with us. So where do we even start on the social justice journey? The first thing that we have to do as parents or adults in children's lives is we have to understand our own implicit biases. And many of us think we do, but the trick of implicit biases, or why they're so tricky, is that many times, because they're so unconscious and subconscious, our explicit biases and our implicit biases may in fact be different. So explicitly, we might think we're not racist or we're not engaging in racist practices, but implicitly, the things that we do, the places that we choose to live, maybe where we send our kids to school, the folks that we socialize with, where we go to community events or not, where we get our groceries, all of that might be informed by implicit biases that we've had that have built over time. And these attitudes can bleed into and impact then our workplace, our school, healthcare systems, and they really influence every action and decision that we make. So I want to do a quick little activity with you, kind of illustrate how implicit biases work, because again, I think many of us think we understand these concepts until we're confronted with imagery or we're confronted with things that elicit our implicit biases. So for this really quick activity, all I want you to do is look at the pictures that I'm going to put up here for you. And as you are observing these images, I want you to take note of a few things. I want you to pay attention to any automatic thoughts that you're having. What automatic feelings are you having? And then do those feelings shift over time as you continue to observe the pictures? And pay attention to which of the two pictures really stands out to you and why. And if you feel moved, feel free to put your reactions in the chat. I would love to see them. But of course, no pressure. This is intended to be a reflective activity. So let's start with our first picture. So again, as you observe the picture, pay attention to what your automatic thought is, what your initial emotions are, and then if these emotions shift over time, and what you feel as a whole. Yeah, I see a comment that says this is probably something many children of color face in toy stores. Yeah, it's shifted some, but it's very different growing up, absolutely. Highlights needs for representation. All right, let's look at picture number 2. Any thoughts or feelings folks want to share? So I love these images because, like I said, sometimes for us, when we have to confront our implicit biases, it takes some visual representation or real world experience to have it come up. And these pictures, to me, I call them like brain glitches. Our brains kind of make us stop and look at them twice. And we pause because something feels not right in the images because of how we've been socialized over the centuries and decades for what is correct or incorrect in some of this imagery. So if we look at that original picture with the dolls, the first picture with the dolls, oftentimes this does start to raise conversations about representation and how you, children of color, get to have this variety or diversity in dolls when they walk into a store. I know that when I try and look for multicultural dolls or doll families for my child, it's nearly impossible to find one that looks like him, unless I want to spend hundreds of dollars, which isn't very accessible for families of color. But if you walked into Target, you would see a whole aisle of white baby dolls. It also brings up those historic doll studies and what we know that representation does for internalized racism and racial biases as well. And then this picture is a really powerful one. It's one of the ones that makes me pause the longest, maybe. And I can't think of the countless number of images that we've seen this in the reverse, where we've seen Black women acting as wet nurses for white families historically. And, you know, we don't bat an eye when we see that. But when we see this image, it makes us pause. It might make us feel uncomfortable or uneasy. Something feels not right because we aren't used to seeing this power differential represented this way. And even if we think of things from a resource standpoint, historical traumas, intergenerational traumas, we know that Black and Indigenous communities in this country have really given up resources in a number of ways, including in these day-to-day parenting related ways too, which have then caused continued disparities intergenerationally too. So along with understanding our implicit biases, it's also really important that we understand our own privileges too. And privilege gets a bad rep. It has a really negative connotation these days, but all we mean when we're speaking to privilege is this idea that each of us, every single one of us, has a social advantage or prestige or benefit in some way or another in society. And this is simply based on an individual being or belonging to a certain social identity group. I'm so sorry, my dog is losing his mind, so I apologize if you hear him in the background. And privilege often becomes associated with things like race, but we can have privilege ranging from things like ability, class, gender identity, educational status, you name it, religion, religious affiliation. I am from a religious minority in this country, so my family grew up practicing Hinduism. So what privilege looks like for folks who practice Christianity or Judaism or anything else that's better recognized in this country is that there's PTO or holidays that are granted for folks during those holiday times, versus if I wanted to celebrate a Hindu holiday, I'd have to take unpaid leave or find ways to take time off myself. It's not accounted for in my PTO or holidays. That's just a small example. Privilege becomes really important for us to understand because it helps us understand our blind spots and then again, our implicit biases. And then if we can understand our privileges, it helps us better advocate for those who don't get afforded the same privileges or the same opportunities. Privilege is also tricky because it tends to be invisible to us. So folks get very defensive if we start to comment on or point out somebody's privilege, because it doesn't negate the fact that you've experienced hardships to get to where you are. It just also means that you also have social advantages that help you in certain capacities that maybe somebody with those same advantages does not. So we're going to watch a quick video to illustrate this. Oops. Maybe. Give me 1 second. Let me pull it up on YouTube really quickly. Okay, can we see that? Oh no, looks like it's not gonna let me play it. Why don't I will send you the video when as one of our resources so that we're not taking up too much time. So we'll get back to our presentation. Oops, maybe it'll let me move on. There we go. Another thing that's really important for us to do as parents is to make sure that we are educating ourselves. So when we think of these conversations around race, many times because it makes us feel uncomfortable, folks think that the way that we should move or the things that we should say is approach it with this colorblind ideology of I don't see color. But this approach is actually very harmful and is a more covert form of racism. So what it really does is it ignores experiences of marginalized groups. And for children, if we are talking about color or race or skin color, and a child is commenting on those things and we tell them that we don't see skin color, it's actually really invalidating their experience with understanding these differences. And what we're tending to do by taking this colorblind ideology is we are teaching children to avoid these meaningful discussions about race and culture and telling them to ignore these very real things. And colorblind ideology, like I said, is problematic because it erases experiences, it erases the historical and intergenerational impacts that many marginalized communities have experienced. And you're basically telling a person that you don't see them completely. So I've been speaking to this idea of marginalized experience and intergenerational impact. So I have to talk about historic and intergenerational traumas. So historically, Black and Indigenous communities in this country have experienced trauma and trauma-related symptoms as a collective that exacerbate the stress response in these communities. And the stress response can look like greater rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD-like symptoms. So we've had several studies document this response, and things like witnessing and living through racism and discrimination, or witnessing somebody else experience racism and discrimination can elicit things like anxiety, aggression, sadness, difficulties with concentrating, sleep and appetite changes, all of which mimic PTSD-like symptoms. And we also know that in 2020, we saw an uptick and a rise in racial trauma following exposure to police brutality videos on social media, which many times folks, we can't control the access to those things because a lot of those videos are just very readily available on those sites. So we saw an increase in these types of mental health needs for these marginalized communities. In order for us to kind of combat these racial trauma impacts, we have to then build up more resiliency and protective factors, which is where, from a parenting standpoint, it's important that we equip our children with ways to cope through these things. So I mentioned intergenerational impacts on Indigenous and Black communities specifically in this country. What this looks like is for Indigenous folks, the impacts of colonization and then resettlement and reservation to then boarding schools, all of this historical trajectory impacts current parenting and mental health outcomes in these communities today. It also impacts health outcomes. So we know that experiences with trauma increase stress response in the body, which also increases health risks for things like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, lung disease, substance use, you name it. The same goes for Black communities in this country. If you look at the impacts of enslavement to then Jim Crow to now mass incarceration in the school to prison pipeline, all of that has impacts on current parenting and mental health outcomes. So what families, specifically Black families, tend to do is they tend to prepare their children for the inevitable of experiencing racism and discrimination in this world. And that process is called racial socialization. So they teach children, or they have the quote unquote talk, which you might have heard of, about how to behave in a society in which they are at risk for experiences with racism and discrimination. And we equip them with ways to deal with that and cope with that in a healthy way. What we know through science is that racial socialization is incredibly protective for mental health outcomes for children from Black communities. What needs to happen is that all of us need to be practicing racial socialization practices. We'll talk about how. One of the most important things we need to do as caregivers or adults in children's lives is we need to start to make space for race. That means we just need to have conversations and acknowledge that race exists. Like I said, children notice these race-based differences really early in development, and they want language to understand the world around them. We want to welcome that curiosity, validate their experience by naming those race-based experiences, and then also providing them with tools on how to address that. What we know through recent literature is that Black children and teens experience, on average, 5 or more experiences of microaggressions and racism daily. And we know that while microaggressions look micro, over time, they have this compounding effect on mental health outcomes for these youth. So since YouTube isn't working, I'm going to skip this, but like I said, I will send these video resources when we're done for you all to watch in your own time. Part of this process too for us as adults is making sure that we're teaching accuracy and embracing our mistakes. So what I hear a lot of the time when I do DEI related work or equity related work is there's this fear from white communities or non-Black communities and how to approach these conversations because there's this fear of getting it wrong. And I'm here to like normalize the fact that we're all going to get this wrong at some point or another, myself included. I'm still learning. But what's important for us to make sure we do is we take accountability when and if we have created harm in a space. And accountability simply looks like us admitting that we've done something wrong, apologizing for what we've done, and then trying to do better the next time around. And we want to teach children these same things, just as we would if they made a mistake in any other kind of conflict. We want them to just take accountability and understand that this is a learning process. And no one is expected to be perfect or strive for perfection here because that's not attainable. So, racial socialization. Broadly speaking, what racial socialization is a process by which an individual learns about behaviors, values, practices, their identity, and race-related stressors. This process is facilitated by caregivers in a child's life, and all families engage in racial socialization practices to some extent, but for racially minoritized families, these processes are far more explicit, and they serve as a much needed and a necessary protective factor, like I mentioned. Also, like I said, the research shows that individuals who are more racially socialized tend to have better mental health outcomes, and it's much more protective. And exposure to others who are different from us actually helps build individual identity, pride, and empathy, and kindness. So racial socialization is a process by which we expose kids to people who are different from us. We socialize with communities that are different from those that we identify with, while simultaneously exposing them to information from our own culture. We understand and we kind of become and build more of our identity, become more firm in our identity when we recognize differences. So we teach kids to start by celebrating differences. Oftentimes we teach kids to look for similarities when we're teaching them how to make friends or how to find people that they have something in common with, to build like long-standing relationships. But what we also need to be doing is teaching kids to celebrate differences and that differences are okay. And we can simply do so by helping them know that these differences are what make us unique and they're what make us special. We want children to understand that differences are going to exist, and we want them to then welcome these differences And that starts with us modeling and teaching those things explicitly. Like I said, we also want children to be exposed to media from their own culture. We talked about representation if we were looking at those images a little while ago, but representation is so, so, so important. And it's critical to healthy identity development in children. We develop our identities based off of what content we consume, what we're seeing, what we're reading, what we're hearing. And this gives us a sense of belonging and a sense of being. And this provides us more understanding of who we are as an individual. And we want families to have these cultural practices or cultural representation happening openly to then further build pride and self-esteem in one's identity. That's how we become protective of our cultural identity. But it's also important to know that representation alone is not enough. So we have to do something more than just provide representation. That's where intentionality comes in. So it's up to us as caregivers to be thoughtful of how we are intentionally interacting with communities that are unlike our own. So a recent statistic came out in 2022 that 75% of white people in this country have all white social networks and friend groups. That means that they only interact with other white people. And that's great, but that also really limits then our ability to understand people who are unlike us and our ability to take perspectives that are unlike the ones that we hold. And socialization and interactions with groups that are different from our communities of origin is essential for us to start to build these empathic perspective-taking skills. So building relationships with peers and individuals who think, look, and practice differently from us helps children build that empathy and kindness. I like to show these census maps because I think when I talk about the statistics, sometimes folks presume that they live and operate in places that are a little bit more diverse. So I currently reside in Richmond, Virginia. And what you see on these census maps is that each of the colored dots represents the racial group. And all of the colors seem very concentrated together. So the blue dots represent white citizens, the green dots represent Black, red is Asian, orange is Latina. And what you'll see is you'll see clusters of the same color across the state. Then even when you break down our city here in Richmond, which is relatively diverse, you'll see that it is still pretty clustered by color. What that means, and this is related to several different things, again, things like redlining, redistricting, gerrymandering, all of that impacts some of this. But the neighborhoods and the communities that we reside in tend to be the ones that resemble the ones that we come from, so that we identify with and represent, which means that organically for us to be able to interact with folks that are different from us, it's actually pretty tough to do. So we have to be intentional about us seeking out opportunities to interact with and to build relationships with folks that are different from our own communities. So when I show these maps, sometimes people like to think, well, this is Virginia. So maybe that's why I'm from a much more liberal part of this country and we're so much more diverse. And the reality is that the same is true even in our very liberal parts of this country. So here are our census maps of New York, census maps of DC. You'll see the same type of color clustering happening and the same impacts then when it comes to racial socialization. So I have a quick, I'm hoping that it plays really quickly, but there's so many ways for us to start to expose kids, even if you don't have access to communities in your lived spaces. We have access to the internet, we have access to social media, we've got so many books, great TV shows. There are several different ways that we can incorporate diversity into our children's lives. It comes down to us being thoughtful about it. So I have a quick video of something we did a couple of years ago for Pride Month on how we were more inclusive in just our dialogue and our bookshelf in making Pride Month more accessible for our 1.5-year-old. If it plays. Oops. Sorry, y'all, I don't know why it's. Maybe this is a tip to go follow us on social media. You'll be able to find all our videos there. I apologize for that. I am so sorry. Let's keep moving. So heading back to how we instill these principles in our kiddos, I mentioned that part of what we teach children when they're really young is that we want them to look for commonalities. That's how you build a friendship. And commonalities are a really nice way for kids to kind of distill down this idea of relationship building. And it is still really essential and critical for this age from a developmental standpoint in early childhood. But what we also want to teach is that when kids are looking for friendships, we want them to find commonalities that are not race or culture specific. So teach kids that there's more to a person than how they look or what their skin color is. We want them to look for maybe things they have in common with how they play or their activities or interests and beliefs, while still validating when they recognize race-based differences. So like I said, kids might point out to you, their skin color looks like this or their hair looks like that. And what you don't want to do is minimize or deflect or avoid discussion. You want to acknowledge that they noticed that difference and simply just say, you're right, you do have different skin color and you both love to play with dinosaurs. Why don't we go find out what their favorite dinosaur is? And that way you're helping again normalize and validate that what they saw was a difference in how that child looks or presents, but you also have all these really great things in common with them. Let's also focus on those aspects of them as a person. I'm positive that this probably isn't going to play too, but this is a great activity for young children to teach them about differences in skin color and how to look for those similarities. It's on our website too, and in our guide for this on the Parenting Culture webpage, and the videos are all on Instagram. The other thing that's really important for us to do is we have to discuss power and privilege with our children. So along with celebrating these differences, we also have to acknowledge that there are power differentials and there are differences in privilege in our communities. It's important that kids learn about what systemic disadvantage looks like for various groups and then what it means for us to be advocates and what equity means. It's also really important for kids from marginalized communities to understand that systemic disadvantages exist and then how to cope with these stressors. So part of what racial trauma does is it kind of impacts our self-esteem in a way where it makes us feel like we aren't worthy, we don't belong, we're not meant to be in a certain space. What we want kids to do in the face of that is learn how to cope and how to feel empowered in those spaces. It's also really natural for folks from marginalized backgrounds to experience a lot of anger related to those experiences. And what we want to then teach children is it's okay to have feelings of anger, but let's find appropriate channels for that anger or appropriate ways to cope that won't be physically unsafe for us. So another activity on how you can teach equity to children, also available on our Instagram and website. And then it brings me to this book, which is a little bit of a plug, but it was our way of kind of addressing these things and making it more tangible for children. So my partner and I published this book towards the end of last year. And the book follows the life of a white child and a Black child going through the same exact experience, but how it's so nuanced and minutely different, and different in the microaggressions that the Black child experiences. And overall, the day is a great day. Both children have a good day, but the way in which the world responds to each child in the different environments is very different. And if you remember, like we talked about earlier, over time, when kids start to experience these 5 or more microaggressions a day, that has a weathering impact on their mental health and then outcomes. So what we created at the end of the book is a list of questions that families can engage in with their children, simply to start conversations. Something as simple as, did you notice any differences in their day? What did you notice? Did you notice any advantages in their day? What did you notice? Which kind of day would you want to have? Whose day would you want to have? Why? And then it starts this discussion with kids. And we also leave you with a glossary of terms on how to explain something like equity to a small child. How do you explain something like a microaggression to a small child? And gives you language so that kids can start to better understand these practices. Why we thought this was so important is we also know from research that explicit conversations with kids as young as 5 to 7 years old about race can dramatically improve racial biases in as little as 1 week. So if we're having explicit conversations with kids as young as 5, in about a week, we can turn those racial biases around and really shift racial attitudes. And we wanted to create a resource for that. So part of what we speak to, all of the imagery in the book is like very intentionally selected. All of the words are very intentionally selected, and it's all grounded in the science that we're speaking to today. So you'll see in this example, both children are running across the playground. And for Logan, his teachers, they look at Logan, he's so fast. And for Malik, they respond with, Malik is just so busy. We really need to watch him. Again, kind of mention or as a nod to this notion of these microaggressions that kids of color experience daily. We've also touched on the 30 million word gap, which many of you may be familiar with. But we illustrate through the book how Logan's parents are able to read him a bedtime story, but for Malik's parents, because his mother works late and his dad is helping with younger siblings, he can't read him a bedtime story every night. And what we know through science too, the compounding impacts of that 30 million word gap, how that can impact things like learning, language development, social emotional outcomes, all because of access issues or barriers or resources, or just simply reduced time because of parental demands. And then I mentioned that preschool to prison pipeline as well. We know that Black children only make up about 19% of preschool enrollment, but account for 47% of out-of-school suspension. And a recent study conducted through Yale in 2019 found that preschool teachers, regardless of their own race, tended to anticipate negative behaviors in Black children, even when the child was engaging in a neutral behavior. So you'll see in our book, both of the kids are running in for their first day, and Logan's teacher says, wow, you're really excited for your first day. And Malik's teacher says, slow down, you're really excited for your first day. And again, it's not overtly problematic or overtly concerning, but it is covertly problematic and considered a microaggression over time. So it doesn't look like this video is going to play either. But I was going to show you a video of my little one reading this towards the end of last year. So he was not quite 3 yet, he was 2.5. And even when we would speak to him about the imagery in the book and ask him which day he would choose, he would tend to pick Logan's day because it seemed more appealing even to him as a 2-year-old. So I will leave you with my favorite anti-racism quote of all time before I open it up for questions. But part of this process is making sure that we are applying these principles and we're actively living by this. So reading about mountain climbing does not make a mountain climber. The same is true for this social justice work and anti-racism work. Reading about it alone does not make us social justice advocates. We have to live it. We have to breathe it. We have to really apply ourselves and be intentional about it. So I will stop there. I'll even stop sharing in case folks want to turn their cameras on for any questions that you have.
I'll ask a question. I know we have some clinicians in the room, and so while I know that some parents are actively seeking these things out, raise it and ask, one of the things that I think many psychologists, therapists often want to do is be able to help push the boundary when we're working with parents on things. And so do you have any strategies, particularly when working with like white parents, on how to raise some of these conversations?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of my favorite clinicians who does racial socialization work is Dr. Kenneth Hardy, and he outlines these 8 steps for racial socialization. And he talked about it in the context of marginalized communities and groups, but I think it's also equally as important for white families and groups too. And it goes back to those principles of like making space for race. So if you notice or you hear families kind of speaking to these things, it's okay to like open the space for that conversation, right? Instead of ignoring or pretending like they're not saying something that's of concern, right? Even simply something as, oh, I'm wondering like where you're thinking that, where that thinking is coming from, or what happened, or tell us a little bit more about that situation, or what's making you feel that way. And just even starting the conversation is important and like a point of advocacy too, so that you are acknowledging for them that yes, this is a safe space, but you're also going to challenge them to think differently about the way they're seeing the world. Let's see, what do you say to parent of an older child? Is it too late since they missed the window from younger ages? Absolutely not. That's a great question. So I think with older children, you can actually have much more directive conversations with them. So if you look on our website, we actually have a guide called Empowering Children for Conversations About Race and Skin Color. And we give you some conversation stems on how to start to have these discussions with older children too. And a big piece of it is also just grounding it in feeling, and then again, taking that empathic perspective taking approach of, I wonder how this would feel to you if somebody might have said this to you, or if somebody did that to you. What are some thoughts or feelings that you would have? I know you think it might be funny, but here's why it's not. And there's a lot of literature now too, if you look at Ibrahim Kendi's work, and there's also several children's books. I think it's called A Book About Systemic Racism, and it just puts it all in language that's really accessible even for older children. But it's never too late, right? Like I think even many of us adults have a lot to learn when it comes to these principles, and we're all still actively learning. So even older children, it's still possible for us to progress these conversations. Thanks, Lindsay. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is just, I know that there's a lot of discomfort that we feel as adults in approaching these conversations, and the biggest thing is that we just need to have them. I will also say one thing that's sometimes an easy thing to apply in practice for us, especially those of us who are in professional settings and we might be working with communities that are different from our own. I told you my diversity introduction at the start, which is some of those personal identities, which I know is visible to some people, some of those identities. Me just kind of claiming it and naming it for myself is really important in the space and in the room. And I will tell you that if you work with marginalized communities, people want to see that and hear that. There's a lot of literature behind that too, is marginalized communities respond better and build rapport with you faster if they feel like you get it. And sometimes just even if you're somebody who's white, having a white identity is still a cultural identity. So even saying something as simple as a white woman, I might not completely understand this, but I am here to support you through this. I'm here to work with you through this. Let me know what you need from me in this. And I know that I will never fully understand it, but I want you to know you're supported. Even something as simple as that really helps break down barriers and walls because it really validates their experience.
I have a quick question. Do you have thoughts or recommendations on, I know you mentioned like if a young child points out a difference that they're observing to name that and then also show what they share in common. But if you see, I guess like kids are just referring to other kids just based like on their skin tone, I guess would it be like a similar thing of like yes and then more?
Yeah, absolutely. And as they get older, you can even add more language with that, right? So yeah, you're right. Your friend is Black. And what else do you guys have in common? Like, what do you guys like to do for fun? And where does he live? Where do you live? What's your favorite? Like, expanding on it. And you can even say to them, like, so we are all different races and different cultures, which is really important for each of us. But that's not all we are, right? And so that way it's giving kids, again, more language so that they can put and kind of organize their world around them versus us just saying, no, that's wrong. Don't talk to them that way, which is our first reaction. But then we're teaching kids it's wrong to talk about race, which is not what we want to do. Great question. Yeah. Thanks, Karen. Yeah, the comment of modeling, showing kids how to take accountability is really important too. Just acknowledging that we're going to mess up and that messing up is okay. So even folks on here who might do attachment work, like, rupture and repair, right? We know that relationships are going to rupture. We're going to have ruptures in relationships. We're going to have conflict in relationships. That's a normal part of relationships. What's not important is it's not problematic if a conflict or a rupture happens. What's more important is how we repair and that a repair happens. And the same is true here. It's not a problem or important that you messed up here or said something wrong or harmful. What is important is how you recover from it and how you repair that. Yeah, more important than the rupture, absolutely. Other thoughts, questions, comments? If you don't already follow us, please, we've got Instagram, our resources on our website are free. We've got a lot of neat things on there, including a cultural values assessment, which can be helpful when you're working with families that might be different from communities that you represent. And if you're trying to be more culturally responsive in your care and more family centered, that's on there for free. And then we've got several resources and several new ones coming out this month that are focused on gender affirming practices, gender affirming care. How do you talk about gender with kids? How do you respond to kids' difficult questions about gender? All of that's on there too for free. We also even created a guide last June when Roe was overturned on how to talk to kids about reproductive rights or abortion across development. And things to consider. So all of those things are on there. Please access them and please send us any suggestions or even comments on how they've worked with families that you've worked with. We love to hear it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ferguson. And like I said in the chat, we'll send out the recording as soon as it's processed on Zoom, and any additional resources. And feel free to reach out to us, to the Parenting and Family SIG as well if there's any questions.
Thank you all so much.